Something people are curious about when they start learning about the structure of languages, the way languages relate to each other, is the notion of language families. You have these languages that are called the Romance languages, the Germanic languages, there are other languages like that. And on the practical level, people start to realize that, hey, if I know Spanish, it's easier to learn, say, Portuguese or Italian than it would be to go straight into a completely unrelated language. Could you say a little bit about this notion of language families? Should someone try to go in and collect all the languages in a family? How does one gain critical mass to start doing that? What's the approach you've taken there?
Oh, definitely. That's a wonderful question. Yes, sort of pursuing whole language families has been a big part of what I've done for many years of my life, particularly with the Romance language family and the Germanic families that you just mentioned. There's incredible insight into sort of not just the practicality of knowing lots of languages that are related to each other, but understanding how they're related to each other and how they work and how that you can really sort of see deeper into them and understand their connection, and that makes the learning of them a lot easier, actually. So if you sort of approach it with that attitude and think about it, so if I say, gosh, I know that these languages are all closely related to each other, I know their history, I know where they came from, and if I can somehow get an overview of that whole thing with that perspective, it's not a terribly difficult thing to gain access to large numbers of closely related languages. So it's very rewarding on many levels, a practical level, and sort of just insight into what languages are and how they work and that kind of thing. If you have what I call polyitis, at a certain point it becomes not enough of a challenge precisely because they are similar. Sometimes you want to learn something a bit more variegated, but if you get that mix of languages into sort of your repertoire, if you're going to spend your life studying languages, I think it's very valuable to have at least one family that you have a broad overview of, and you can see that, and then a variety of other languages. So, yeah.
Can you say more about how many of these families there are, which ones they are? You could point, a lot of people know about the Romance languages that have a relationship to Latin that influences their vocabulary and grammatical structure. Same thing with the Germanic languages. But when I think beyond the European sphere, I try to think of other language families. I think, say, of East Asian languages, those borrow a lot of vocabulary, say, from classical Chinese, but as far as actual historic relationships to each other, that's much more unclear, and their grammar is not necessarily equivalent. So is the notion of a language family mainly applicable to European languages, or what other families are there?
That's a great question, too. I think, yes, I mean, it was language families were discovered by studying, or by people studying and knowing and using Indo-European languages. And so you mentioned Germanic and Romance are the two sort of largest in Western Europe. There's also the Celtic language family, the Slavic language family. If you start staying in the Indo-European language family, there's the whole Iranian set of languages and the Indic languages. And so then there's Baltic and Slavic languages as well, and a number of distinct families that are there. And then based on that model, people looked and saw, well, in India, for instance, you have the languages of northern India are all Indo-European Indic languages, but in southern India, they're Dravidian languages. And so there's a Dravidian language family, and it has a number of different branches there as well. The sort of classification of languages and putting them into various families is very sort of debated or debatable in a lot of indigenous areas, like the languages of the Native Americas, for instance, and even in some parts of Africa, people wonder if this is, we're going to call this the Bantu language family or the Niger-Congo family, and there are different families in Africa. But in order to sort of really know whether languages belong together or part of a family or something, they have to be pretty thoroughly studied and written down. So it's harder to sort of go with that with languages that are sort of undocumented. But I understand that in places like Indonesia, there are enormous numbers of different language families that could be fascinating to study from an anthropological perspective.
Mm-hmm. So suppose someone is confronted with a language family that they're interested in. Most people will probably have some prior language learning of a single language that will maybe just predispose their choice. But suppose someone, for the sake of the question, is looking at a language family, say the Germanic languages, says, here's a handful of different languages in here. Which one do I start with? Which one gives me the most bang for my buck in terms of sort of accumulating a critical mass, laying a foundation for learning the others? How does one go about thinking that? Are there specific examples for each of the language families that you might have off the top of your head?
Well, I can tell you what I did myself for both the Germanic language family and the Romance language family. And I can also tell you what my father did for the Romance language family at a much more profound degree than I did. So I've had a lot of conversations with him about that. So I can give you, sort of 3 steps to sort of to do it that are sort of programmed, sort of given some thought to the kind of question you asked. If I'm going to plan this and go at it, what are some steps that I can do? That said, I think that there are larger numbers of people that, I don't want to say fall into it, but because the languages, particularly the Romance languages, are major important languages, they end up learning French, Spanish, Italian, Portuguese anyway, and then they see those similarities, and it's not hard to add Romanian to that mix as well. So you could certainly just sort of go at it by interest in various languages. But if you do want to plan for it, what I ended up doing, and I didn't have a conscious plan, but for the Romance language family, I studied first and foremost when I do think as a basic principle for these, you want to go to the root language. For the Romance language family, it's going to be Latin. For the Germanic family, it's harder to give one that has sort of a distinct older ancestor, sort of mother to all of them, sort of categorization. But I'll talk about that more. Let me talk about the Romance languages first. So Latin, what we talked about last week, another benefit is precisely for this. Latin is the mother of all the Romance languages. And if you understand how she is and what she works like, and you can see how the others all diverge from each other, and you can see how they're related as sisters as well, but it makes sense to sort of learn the stock where they come from. So that's another value of learning Latin. So I learned Latin, as we discussed last time, in the traditional way in university, and learned how to read it and used it to do my doctoral research. And so, it's something that I did and had and used. So I'd been doing Latin for about 10 years when I sort of realized that I had the Romance family in me. And French I had been doing just as part of my education since I was 11 years old. And I double majored in French and German literature. And I just kept reading it and using it. And so I'd, had French in me for most of my life. And then I studied Spanish very intensively, seriously, taught it to myself, lived with a Mexican friend in Mexico City for a month, used opportunities that I could to read it and speak it. So I'd learned Latin, French, and Spanish to pretty thorough degrees over a long period of time. And then when I got some exposure to things like Italian and Portuguese, I really felt like, yes, in order to to speak them with any finesse and to really read them, and so you would have to go through some sort of crash course, but you really could just listen and understand for the most part, and pick up a book and understand for the most part, and yes, with the dictionary and grammar, really work it out without having studied it. It was just sort of there. You almost got those in the bargain. So sort of having that feeling about languages sort of came about from, I would say, having the mother language and 2 of the daughters that were really, solidly fixed, and just having what I call language consciousness and a lot of historical philology and things like that as well. So I did something similar with the Germanic family in that because there's no one language that is sort of the root language of them all. But if you want to say, well, let's at least study sort of an older Germanic language, and we can sort of see in English, for example, if you study Old English, Middle English, and then use Modern English, you can see how languages develop in a sense, and you see how Old English is much more similar to German actually than it is to English today. So you could learn a sequence of Germanic languages, which is something that I did. I studied the entire sequence of historical Germanic languages at the University of Chicago. My doctoral program there, it wasn't in depth, but it was like one quarter for, for Old High German, one quarter Middle High German, just getting an overview and looking at it and just sort of going through the entire sequence and understanding how they were related, and then choosing the one of them that has the richest literature, and that's Old Norse, and sort of just plunge myself into Old Norse, reading Old Norse, and wrote my dissertation on that. So I was totally immersed in that for a number of years, and I had, as I said, double majored in French and German in college. So I'd had German since then and kept that up and majored it, and then I got to do my postdoctoral studies in Germany. And so I just plunged myself completely into German. I'd spent a couple of years totally immersed in Old Norse. Then I made German my operating system, and I'd had this overview. And then I went to Sweden, and that was the experience I had. Like, wow, I've never studied Swedish, but hey, I understand what they're saying, and I can really just sort of take a grammar book and read through it and plug in what I know and start talking to people and make a real effort to read it, and sort of just in a couple of weeks be able to be kind of functional in a language. And so that's my experience when you have, like I said, about figured German, Old Norse, and sort of a historical overview with the Romance languages. It was Latin, French, Spanish, and sort of an overview. So if you have sort of a good solid knowledge of 3 languages, it seems like you can start getting the others at a substantial bargain. So that's the way that I have gone about it myself. My father, he made sort of Romance philology he was a cataloger of Romance languages at the University of California. So he was in charge of like ordering and cataloging books from what I think most people probably wrongly, myself too, sometimes think of sort of as Italian dialects, but smaller languages like Sardinian and Corsican and just the whole range of there's, besides national languages in the Romance language family, you have major sort of cultural literary languages like Catalan and Occitan. So, he just sort of plunged into all of them and had a real reading knowledge of it just by keeping his finger on the pulse of what was published in them. So, I don't think that he was not going at it for the language. He just loved the sound of them, and he loved poetry and reading that in them.
To build on that last question, you touched on this in your answer already, but I want to return to this notion of, in learning a language family, this sort of a critical mass, this idea of the learning curve. You mentioned for you the Romance languages, knowing 2 modern ones, and Latin helped you start making sense of the others. The Germanic languages, you also had an approach to that. Suppose for a listener who maybe doesn't have the same interest in, say, the historic root languages, might just have, learned French and now wants to learn Spanish, etc. How many languages might it take to start, listening to a new one and start saying, this makes more sense? That's the first question. And then the second question is, how does one's learning approach change as one starts to make more sense of the other languages in a family? Presumably with the first new language in a family, you'll spend more time with the textbook, with the grammar, etc., or whichever sort of fundamental learning methods. Is there a certain point where you discard those for a new language? How does that work?
Well, yeah, like I said, I mean, when you start, I could just like go, oh wow, I can pick up a book in Catalan and read it. But there's a lot I don't understand. I want to understand why I don't understand. I want to understand the forms. Yes, I'd love to pick up a Catalan grammar and read through it and have things like that. So you don't just get everything immediately transparent, but the degree to which it's not like learning a new language anymore. It's if I could make an analogy to music, it's like variations upon a theme. There's a number of famous works for the flute. I play the flute. The Morin Murray has Les Folies d'Espagne. And so there's one main tune, you learn that, and then there's, 15, 20, 30 variations where you change the key and you change some of the arpeggios going up or going down. And, it's demonstrably the same piece, but you've made some alterations, and the alterations are systematic. And I think languages are the same way. I think that there's sort of a basic, if you talk about a language family, you can think of, well, what is the theme? What is the main theme, the main sound of this language family? And then the various languages in it are kind of like those variations upon the theme. So if you're learning how to play Bach's Goldberg variations on the piano, I mean, I think that's the main tune, and then you learn a number of variations and you can sort of see how they're going. And of course, if you want to play any one of them well, you have to practice it and practice it and practice it. But if you want to say, oh, I know how the variations work, you can get an overview pretty easily by taking sort of that approach.
So this is a two-part question, maybe starting to wrap up, but just focusing on English, because presumably whoever's watching this video understands English, knows some English. English, as I understand it, is historically a Germanic language. There's a heavy injection of Romance languages in there as far as vocabulary style. Where does English exactly fall in this language family map?
Well, yeah, that's one advantage that we native English speakers have in sort of going at language families, is that English poises you pretty well to go both into the Romance languages and into the Germanic languages. You can think of English basically as a little Germanic girl that went to a Romance school her whole life. So I think on average about maybe 70% of the words in English are said to be derived either directly from Latin or through French, Spanish, Italian into English or something. So the vocabulary of English, particularly in higher registers with, words of 3 or 4 syllables are probably going to be of Romance origin, whereas words of 1 or 2 syllable are more likely to be Germanic. And the root of English is Germanic based, but it is undergone a lot of simplification over time in terms of grammar. It doesn't have the sort of inflecting structure it used to have, like Old English had. But like I said, if you know that, if you can learn Old English, Middle English, and Modern English, I think that is a good springboard for somebody with English to understand that relationship between the languages. But yeah, so English is sort of in its root, in its base, it's Germanic, but in most of its educated vocabulary, it's Romance.
Follow up on that question then, for an English speaker, maybe a native English speaker, who wants to get their foot in the door of the other languages in, say, the Germanic and Romance language families. What are your personal recommendations? Is there some advantage to starting, say, with Dutch or with German versus Icelandic? Does it just matter that I pick one and learn it well? Same thing with the Romance languages. What are your personal recommendations for a language to start with, assuming this is just a pure native English speaker, to start accumulating this mass toward learning a language family?
Well, I mean, in a certain sense, I would just say, okay, if somebody is interested in that, has any, particular interest in any particular language and has a particular opportunity to learn that, then that's the one that they should go for. Somebody who's particularly interested in Icelandic, and has opportunities to learn Icelandic, that would be a fine place to start. But a lot of people think sort of more practically. It's like, well, I want to learn a language, I want to have lots of opportunities to use it and lots of things to be able to speak it. And Icelandic is a very small language compared to Dutch or German or most of the others as well. So if you think in those terms, people would say, well, the languages that are kind of largest and most useful, and here I'm going to say this is a scholarly project, I would recommend French and German because of not just their size, but because of the number of things, publications, learning manuals that you might access. If you know these languages well, there's a lot of stuff written in them that will help you learn the others. But Spanish or Italian would be, if somebody has more roots or more interest in this, certainly plenty of materials in these languages as well.